All right, welcome to our brief lecture talking about the role of site and situation in European exploration. The slides were designed to accompany the textbook People, Places, and Culture, and I am, of course, Miss Gall, and I'll be your host for the lecture. So, when we talk about site and situation during European exploration and the initial phases of colonialism, a big piece of what we need to understand is what trade routes were like before Europeans started to explore, and then we can talk a little bit about what they were like after. So when we're talking about exploration, we're talking about European trade routes. Virtually all of the trade routes were over land, or at best, what you have are ships kind of trailing along the coast. Any route where we're going from Europe to Asia, though, is always an overland route. They don't they don't sail around the coast of Africa until uh, really in the 1500s. So, and we call that trade route, by the way, from Europe to Asia, the Silk Road, and it traces across the modern Middle East and then up into China. All right. Once once exploration begins, then the trade routes start to change and they become much more ocean-based. And so that's really what we're going to be talking about in this lecture, is that swap from a primarily land-based um, trade route to an ocean-based trade route, and what that meant in terms of the relative importance of various cities, right? So when we're talking about cities like Paris, which obviously is in France, or Xi'an, which is in China, both of them are interior cities, right? Paris is kind of in the middle-ish of France, and Xi'an, if I remember correctly, is well inland in China, right? So the trade routes are tracing not just from those cities, but through those cities, okay? And they become important trading hubs because the trade is running through those cities. Once European exploration starts to take off in the late 1400s, those interior cities decline in relative importance. So in other words, their situation changes. They're no longer along the major trade routes. Now they're just kind of off in the middle of nowhere. Right? Another great example of this, if we want to talk about Africa, is the great, hugely important trading post of Timbuktu. I know, I just heard you laugh because these days we use Timbuktu as a byword for nowhere. Right? Ah, it's off in Timbuktu. But Timbuktu used to actually be a very large city, huge trading post in the middle of well, not really in the middle of Africa, but in Africa, right? And these days, because those trade routes have swapped to more ocean-based, right, starting in the 1400s, that's another example of a city where its power, its prestige just shot through the floor and its situation changed. That makes a huge difference when we're talking about importance of cities. What ends up happening instead is that coastal cities, cities along the ocean shores, become tremendously more important. So their situation changes, and it changes in a good way, right? Just because of their relative site. So for instance, London, which is a short way up the Thames in England, becomes, I mean, it was always an important city in England, but it becomes significantly more important when we're talking about Europe because of its site, because it's close to the ocean, because it's near those trade routes, right? So those coastal cities not only remain crucial, but they also go up in importance because of their site and because their situation changes. So when we start talking about European trade networks, right, the trade networks expand tremendously, including things like the slave trade, by the way. So we're not just, and it's not just the slave trade. There's also a huge trade in goods and services, or goods really more than anything else, although some limited services develop along with that. But what these increasing trade networks do is they bring significant power and really unprecedented money to cities like Amsterdam, which is in the Netherlands, London, obviously we already talked about a little bit in England, Lisbon, which is on the coast of Portugal, Liverpool, which is another huge port city in England, and Seville, which is in Spain. Right. So these are the cities that really start to take off and thrive during this period of what's called mercantilism. And they all kind of take on roughly similar properties. which is to say that they start to develop as significant trading posts. You start to see significantly more population, right? With this huge amount of money that's coming in between the better trade and then also the exploitation of the colonies. Um, the cost of things goes down, right? Because these cities get flooded with money. You see the development of the modern banking system and things like that. Mercantilism, by the way, is just a fancy schmancy word that really talks about this early capitalist system. And so it's really under this mercantilist system that you start to see the development of things like insurance, for instance, for voyages, that you start to see a lot of the trappings in the modern capitalist world. So I know I've tried to very much narrow my focus and talk about site and situation and not done a little more history than I might have, but really the big key points to this whole lecture, and I'm going to kind of sum it up here. One, site matters. Okay, and site, remember back to unit 1, is the physical characteristics of a location. So site matters, right? Places that are inland, their site early in the development of these trade networks, very, very important because they're along the trade routes between Europe and Asia, and even to a large degree between Europe and especially Northern Africa. Right? But because Europeans start to explore and they start that exploration down the coast of Africa, they start making their way slowly but surely across the Atlantic, the situation of those inland cities and of those coastal cities changes tremendously. And the inland cities go way, way down in relative importance in terms of trade, and the coastal cities go way, way up. And so for some cities, like for example Paris, you don't see it go back up in terms of its importance along trade routes until you see the development, for instance, of railroads, which then facilitate that movement of goods out of Paris and to the coastal cities. So those are kind of our big points. If you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. Please just feel free to come see me during class, and I'll see you next time we meet.